the loneliest position in the air war. On the morning of July 30th, 1943, a B-17 bomber prepared for another mission from an airfield in eastern England. For most of the crew, it was one more flight in a war already measured in exhaustion and loss. For the man climbing into the tail section, it was something else entirely. Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth was 24 years old. He had already completed 12 combat missions over occupied Europe and had claimed 3 enemy fighters destroyed. That morning, he crawled into a compartment barely large enough for his body, sealed behind a curved plexiglass enclosure at the very rear of the aircraft. From there, he would face the enemy alone. The tail gunner's station was infamous, 4 feet wide, 5 feet long, no room to stand, barely room to move. 2.50 caliber Browning machine guns pointed backward into empty sky. 40 feet of aluminum fuselage separated the gunner from the rest of the crew. If something went wrong, no one could reach him in time. At cruising altitude, the temperature outside would fall to nearly minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The only thing keeping Aruth alive was an electrically heated flight suit. Failure meant freezing to death long before the aircraft ever reached Germany. The 8th Air Force had a name for the job. They called it the loneliest position in the war. Statistics explained why. In the summer of 1943, a B-17 crew could expect to survive roughly 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners died faster than almost anyone else in the bomber force. German fighter pilots preferred attacking from the rear. The tail absorbed the first bullets, the first cannon shells, the first fatal hits. By midsummer, Aruth's bombardment group had already lost multiple aircraft. Dozens of men were gone. The air war was turning into mathematics, and the numbers were brutal. German pilots understood geometry. Approaching from directly behind gave them the longest firing window. A fighter closing from the 6 o'clock position at high speed had nearly 10 seconds to aim and fire before passing the bomber. The tail gunner had those same seconds to hit a target moving at combined speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. Most tail gunners never got that chance. Aircraft, like the Focke-Wulf 190, carried heavy cannons capable of shredding the tail compartment in a single burst. One accurate pass could kill the gunner instantly and cripple the bomber's control surfaces. Once the tail was disabled, the fighters could circle back and finish the aircraft at will. American gunnery doctrine offered a solution, at least on paper. Gunners were taught to wait, conserve ammunition, fire only when the enemy closed inside 300 yards. The logic worked in classrooms. In the sky, 300 yards meant the enemy was already firing. Aruth had seen the consequences. On an earlier mission, a neighboring bomber took a direct hit to its tail. The fighter attacked fast and from long range. Cannon shells punched through the plexiglass before the American gunner ever pulled the trigger. The bomber fell out of formation, trailing smoke. Parachutes appeared. The tail gunner never did. The manuals demanded patience. The enemy exploited it. German pilots had learned American habits and built their attacks around them. They fired early, knowing the gunners would hesitate. By the time defensive fire began, the damage was already done. Aruth began to question everything. If the enemy attacked from long range because American gunners waited, then waiting was killing them. A fighter flying straight toward the tail presented a large, predictable target. Its apparent size grew rapidly with closing speed. Early fire could disrupt the attack before the enemy ever reached effective range. The cost was ammunition. 800 rounds sounded generous, until a mission produced 20 or 30 separate attacks. Fire too early, and the guns might fall silent before the aircraft reached home. Aruth accepted the risk. A gunner who conserved ammunition but died on the third attack had made the wrong calculation. Survival required breaking the enemy's attack before it succeeded. If that meant running low on bullets later, he would face that problem when he was still alive to face it. That morning, more than 100 bombers lifted into the gray English sky. Fighter escorts would protect them only part of the way. Fuel limits guaranteed that the final stretch into Germany would be flown alone. Aruth checked his ammunition belts one last time. He had already decided the manuals were wrong. By noon, he would find out whether his reasoning would save his crew or get him killed. Breaking the pattern. Once the bombers crossed the coast of occupied Europe, the sky changed character. Radio chatter tightened, engines settled into a steady roar, and somewhere behind the formation, German fighters began to climb. From the tail compartment, Michael Aruth saw them first, small shapes far back against the pale sky. At that distance they looked harmless, almost slow. Experience said otherwise. Those dots were accelerating, and they were coming straight in. Standard procedure said to wait. Training said to hold fire. Doctrine said to conserve ammunition. Aruth ignored all three. The moment the lead fighter committed to the attack run, he opened fire. At over 600 yards, the range was considered wasteful. The bullets would spread. Accuracy would be poor. Hits were unlikely. That was the theory. Reality disagreed. The sudden stream of tracers forced the German pilot to react immediately. The fighter rolled slightly, adjusting its approach. That small correction changed everything. The perfect, straight-line attack was gone. The firing window narrowed. The pilot had to aim while maneuvering instead of lining up calmly behind the bomber. Aruth adjusted his aim and kept firing in controlled bursts, not spraying wildly, not emptying the belts, just enough pressure to force mistakes. The fighter broke off early. It did not explode. It was not destroyed. But it failed to deliver its attack, and that mattered more than a kill. Within minutes, another fighter came in. Same direction, same tactic. Aruth fired again at long range. The tracers walked toward the cockpit. The German pilot veered off, diving away beneath the formation. Below him, the bomber remained intact. What Aruth was doing went against everything written in the manuals. But the sky was not a classroom. German pilots had adapted faster than doctrine. They knew when American gunners would open fire. They exploited hesitation. They attacked from ranges that minimized their own risk. By firing early, Aruth flipped the equation. Instead of allowing the enemy to dictate the moment of engagement, he forced the enemy to react immediately. Every attacking pilot now had to decide whether to continue through incoming fire or break off and try again later. That decision bought time. Time allowed the bomber to stay in formation. Time allowed other gunners to engage. Time reduced the accuracy of incoming fire. As the mission continued, attacks multiplied. Fighters came in pairs, then groups. Some approached from slightly higher angles, others from below. Aruth shifted constantly, tracking one target while monitoring another forming behind it. Ammunition counters dropped faster than doctrine allowed, but the tail remained intact. At one point, a fighter closed aggressively, refusing to break. Aruth fired continuously, adjusting lead as the aircraft filled his sight. The tracers converged. Pieces flew from the enemy's wing root. The fighter rolled violently and disappeared downward in smoke. No celebration followed. There was no time. Another fighter was already lining up. Inside the bomber, the crew felt the difference even if they did not see it. Attacks came shorter. Impacts were fewer. The aircraft remained stable. Control surfaces responded normally. The tail was still there. By mid-mission, Aruth had fired far more ammunition than recommended. The belts were thinning. The cold pressed harder. His heated suit strained against the altitude. But the bomber was still flying. German pilots noticed too. Repeated early fire changed their behavior. Some began attacking from wider angles. Others hesitated longer before committing. The long, confident firing runs from directly behind became less frequent. The geometry of the fight had shifted. Aruth was not chasing kills. He was denying solutions. Every disrupted attack was a victory measured in seconds and meters rather than wreckage. Every fighter that broke early meant one less cannon burst through the tail. This was not heroism. It was adaptation. By the time the bombers reached their target area, Aruth's ammunition was low, but his aircraft was undamaged. And most importantly, his crew was alive. The mission was only half over. The most dangerous part still lay ahead. Because German fighters rarely attacked hardest on the way in. They waited for the bombers to turn for home. The long way back. The bombs were gone, and the aircraft turned west. For most crews, that moment brought relief. For a tail gunner, it marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase of the mission. German fighters preferred to strike after the bomb run. By then, formations were looser, aircraft were lighter, and crews were tired. Some bombers lagged behind, others drifted slightly out of position. These were the targets the Luftwaffe waited for. From his station at the very back of the aircraft, Michael Aruth watched the formation stretch as it turned for home. Engines adjusted. Spacing widened. The sky behind them looked deceptively empty. Then the dots appeared again. They came faster this time. The fighters did not bother with careful approach angles. They dove from above and behind, using gravity to build speed. The intention was clear. One violent pass, heavy cannon fire, then climb away before the gunners could react. Aruth did not wait. He opened fire the instant the first fighter committed to its dive. Tracers reached out long before the enemy reached ideal range. The bullets did not need to destroy the aircraft. They only needed to force a decision. The German pilot flinched. That hesitation, measured in fractions of a second, threw off the attack. The fighter's firing window collapsed. The cannon burst that followed was short and inaccurate. The bomber shuddered but held steady. No critical hits. Aruth shifted to the next target. The sky behind the bomber became a constant stream of motion. Fighters approached, broke off, circled back, then tried again. Some pressed harder. Others abandoned the rear attack entirely and searched for easier prey. Ammunition ran dangerously low. Each belt fed faster than Aruth wanted. The counters dropped. He forced himself to fire in bursts, even when instinct screamed to hold the triggers down. Panic wasted bullets. Control preserved them. The cold intensified. Frost crept along the edges of the plexiglass enclosure. His heated suit struggled to compensate. Fingers stiffened. Breathing became shallow and deliberate. Inside the bomber, the rest of the crew trusted the tail without ever seeing what was happening. They felt fewer impacts than expected. They stayed in formation longer. The aircraft remained controllable. That was the measure of success. Another fighter dove aggressively, ignoring early fire. Aruth adjusted his lead and committed. The tracers converged. The enemy aircraft shuddered, rolled sharply, and dropped out of sight. Smoke followed it down. Whether it crashed or recovered did not matter. It was gone. Minutes passed that felt like hours. The formation crept closer to the coast. The density of attacks thinned. German pilots were running out of fuel, patience, or opportunities. By the time the bombers reached friendly airspace, Aruth's ammunition was nearly exhausted. The tail guns fell silent, not because the danger had passed, but because there was nothing left to fire. The bomber crossed the coastline intact. No fires. No control failures. No missing crew. When the aircraft landed back in England, ground crews counted bullet holes along the fuselage. There were fewer than expected, especially in the tail section. Aruth climbed out of his compartment stiff, half-frozen, and exhausted. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply understood something important. The rules had not kept him alive. Breaking them had. Word spread quietly among gunners. Some listened. Others stuck to the manuals. Results varied accordingly. Aruth would fly more missions, and with each one the lesson became clearer. In the air war over Europe, survival belonged not to those who followed doctrine perfectly, but to those who adapted faster than the enemy. When experience rewrites the rules, combat does not care about manuals. It exposes them. As missions accumulated, patterns became impossible to ignore. Bombers that survived heavy fighter contact often had one thing in common. Someone disrupted the attack early, not with perfect marksmanship, not with textbook restraint, but with aggression, timed to break the enemy's approach before it matured into a kill. What Michael Arth had done instinctively was being rediscovered by others through loss. Crews that waited for optimal range were losing tail gunners at alarming rates. Crews that pressured fighters early, forcing evasive action before cannon fire, were coming home damaged, but alive. The change did not happen overnight, and it did not come from headquarters first. It spread horizontally, from gunner to gunner, whispered in briefing rooms and mess halls. Fire sooner. Don't let them settle in. Make them react. Veteran gunners adjusted their sights and habits. They learned to read intent rather than distance. A fighter that committed straight in was the real danger, not one that hovered at the edge of range. Early fire turned a calculated attack into a gamble the enemy did not want to take. German pilots noticed the shift. Rear attacks grew less confident. Approaches widened. Firing windows shortened. Some fighters attempted head-on passes instead, trading the risk of defensive fire for speed. Others disengaged entirely when early tracers reached them. This adaptation did not make bombers invulnerable. Losses continued, but the balance of initiative began to tilt. The tail was no longer a passive target waiting for permission to defend itself. Aruth's group began seeing fewer catastrophic tail hits. The section behind the aircraft, once shredded regularly, showed signs of survival. Plexiglass cracked instead of exploding. Control cables held. Gunners stayed alive long enough to fight again. Doctrine lagged behind reality, as it often does. Official manuals changed slowly, constrained by training pipelines and institutional caution. But combat units were already operating ahead of the paperwork. Experience had become the real instructor. For the men inside the aircraft, the effect was tangible. Crews trusted their tail gunners more. Pilots held formation longer, knowing the rear was actively defended. The bomber box stayed tighter. Mutual support improved. Aruth did not seek recognition. He did not file reports or demand changes. He flew, adapted, and survived. That was the currency of the air war. Survival validated ideas faster than any memo. The Luftwaffe responded in turn. Fighters attacked in greater numbers, hoping to overwhelm defenses. They coordinated passes, trying to saturate gunners. The sky behind the bombers became crowded and violent. Defensive fire intensified. The air war escalated. Each side learned from the other, but one advantage favored the Americans: replacement. Gunners who survived passed knowledge forward. Crews rotated home after completing tours. Lessons accumulated instead of dying with the men who learned them. The tail position remained lethal. It always would. But it was no longer a death sentence guaranteed by hesitation. Experience had done what theory could not. It had rewritten the rules in real time. And as missions continued into the most dangerous months of the bombing campaign, those rewritten rules would be tested again. Under worse odds, heavier opposition, and skies that offered no mercy. The arithmetic of staying alive. By the summer of 1943, the air war over Europe had become a problem of numbers rather than courage. Bravery was assumed. What mattered now was probability. Every mission added another layer to a calculation few crews wanted to complete. Survival was no longer about one fight. It was about enduring many. For a bomber crew in the 8th Air Force, the odds were unforgiving. Aircraft were expected to complete a tour of missions before being rotated home, but statistics made that goal feel abstract. Loss rates fluctuated, yet the average remained grim. Crews understood that the longer they stayed in the air, the more likely it became that chance would catch up with them. Tail gunners felt this arithmetic more sharply than anyone else. German fighter tactics were designed around efficiency. Attacking from the rear maximized exposure time and minimized defensive overlap. A successful tail attack often meant the end of the bomber within seconds. When a tail position failed, the rest of the aircraft followed quickly. Survival hinged on preventing that first clean pass. This reality forced gunners to think differently. Instead of asking, "When should I fire?" the more important question became, "How do I shorten the enemy's opportunity?" Every second denied to an attacking fighter reduced the likelihood of a fatal hit. Early pressure mattered more than perfect aim. Michael Aruth and others like him began to view ammunition as a tool for disruption, not just destruction. A burst that forced a pilot to break alignment was worth more than a burst that missed, but came too late. Even inaccurate fire had value if it altered behavior. The Luftwaffe understood risk as well. Fighter pilots were not reckless. They sought attacks that promised results with minimal exposure. When early fire made rear approaches unpredictable, the cost-benefit calculation changed. Some pilots chose different angles. Others searched for bombers that still waited too long to defend themselves. This selective pressure reshaped the battlefield. Bombers with aggressive tail defense became harder targets. Fighters gravitated toward weaker aircraft. Losses did not disappear, but they redistributed. Crews that adapted improved their chances incrementally, sometimes by margins so small they were only visible over multiple missions. Inside the aircraft, this shift altered morale. Crews who believed their defenses were active flew differently. Formations tightened. Pilots trusted their gunners. Engineers reported fewer catastrophic tail failures. Damage occurred, but aircraft stayed controllable long enough to reach home. The arithmetic remained harsh. Ammunition still ran out. Fighters still broke through. Luck still decided outcomes. But the curve bent slightly in favor of those who learned faster. Aruth's own record reflected this shift. He survived missions that statistically should have ended differently. Not because he was invulnerable, but because he reduced exposure repeatedly. Each disrupted attack pushed probability in his favor, one decision at a time. Commanders noticed patterns emerging from after-action reports. Bombers lost later in missions often showed delayed defensive fire. Crews that returned with damage frequently reported early engagement of attackers. Data began to align with experience. The air war was teaching its own lessons. Survival was no longer a matter of isolated heroics. It was a cumulative effect of small, repeated choices made under pressure. Choices that turned 10 seconds into 6, 6 into 4, 4 into none. The math never became kind, but it became manageable. And as the summer wore on, that difference, measured in seconds and meters, kept more crews alive long enough to fly again. When the tail holds, the bomber lives. As the summer of 1943 progressed, one truth became increasingly clear inside bomber formations. The fate of the aircraft was often decided at the tail. When the rear held, the rest of the bomber usually survived long enough to escape. When it failed, everything unraveled fast. German pilots understood this as well as the Americans. Their most reliable kills came from clean, uninterrupted approaches directly behind the bomber. A fighter that could settle into that lane, steady, aligned, and undisturbed, held the advantage. Cannon shells ripped through control cables, elevators, and the thin skin of the tail section. Once that happened, the bomber was no longer a fighting machine. It became a falling object. What changed was not the aircraft. It was the behavior. Tail gunners who fired early denied attackers the calm, predictable run they needed. Fighters forced to jink, climb, or break off lost accuracy. Their cannon bursts shortened. Their confidence eroded. A disrupted attack often meant the pilot had to circle back, burning fuel and exposing himself to crossfire from other gunners. This had a cascading effect across the formation. When rear attacks failed, German pilots tried alternative angles, high rear quarters, shallow dives, head-on passes. Each carried greater risk. Head-on attacks reduced exposure time, but increased the chance of collision or defensive fire from multiple positions. Wide-angle approaches shortened firing windows. The airspace behind the bombers became hostile in ways it had not been before. Inside the bomber, the difference was tangible. Crews felt fewer violent shudders from cannon hits. Control surfaces responded more reliably. The aircraft stayed in formation longer. Damage still occurred. Holes in the fuselage, shattered plexiglass, disabled guns. But the catastrophic failures slowed. Michael Aruth's role illustrated this shift perfectly. His goal was not to win the fight behind the bomber. It was to prevent the loss of control. Every time an attacker broke early, the bomber gained seconds. Seconds allowed pilots to correct course, allowed other gunners to engage, allowed the formation to maintain cohesion. Cohesion mattered more than armor. A bomber that stayed within the protective envelope of the formation benefited from overlapping fire. Stragglers died quickly, Aircraft that drifted out of position became magnets for attack. Early tail defense reduced the likelihood of becoming isolated in the first place. The change also influenced crew psychology. Pilots trusted their tail gunners more. They held formation through turbulence and evasive maneuvers instead of braking prematurely. Bombardiers completed runs with fewer interruptions. Engineers reported systems surviving damage that would previously have been fatal. None of this made the mission safe. Losses continued. Fighters still found openings. Ammunition still ran dry. Cold still numbed hands. Fatigue still dulled reactions. But the shape of loss changed. Instead of sudden, total destruction, damage became survivable more often than not. Aircraft limped home instead of vanishing. Crews returned shaken, injured, but alive. This mattered beyond individual missions. Survivors carried experience forward. They taught replacements what worked. They passed down habits not found in manuals. The formation grew smarter because fewer lessons were paid for with total loss. By late summer, the Luftwaffe's preferred rear attack had lost some of its reliability. It was still dangerous, but no longer automatic. The tail had become an active barrier instead of a waiting target. When the tail held, the bomber lived. And when the bomber lived, the crew flew again. That cycle, survive, learn, teach, became the real engine of adaptation in the air war. The question now was whether that adaptation would last long enough, because the enemy was learning too, and the battles ahead would test every lesson learned so far. Limits, fatigue, and the cost of staying alive. Adaptation did not remove limits. It exposed them. By late summer 1943, the men who survived repeated missions carried a different kind of burden. They were better gunners, sharper observers, and more disciplined crewmen. But they were also exhausted. Survival had a price that accumulated quietly, mission after mission. For tail gunners, fatigue was physical and mental. Hours spent hunched in a frozen compartment stiffened muscles and dulled reaction time. Fingers lost sensation. Vision blurred from cold and vibration. Concentration had to be rebuilt on every sortie, even as the body resisted. A single lapse could reopen the window the enemy needed. Ammunition remained finite. Early defensive fire improved survival, but it also meant belts emptied faster. Gunners learned to manage scarcity under pressure. Short bursts, precise lead, ruthless prioritization. When multiple fighters appeared, choices became unavoidable. Engage the closest threat or the most dangerous angle. Save rounds now or risk silence later. These decisions followed men long after landing. Psychological strain compounded the physical toll. Crews watched neighboring aircraft fall away, explode, or spiral downward. They recognized tail numbers and nose art. They knew names. Loss became familiar without becoming acceptable. The distance between us and gone felt frighteningly small. Inside the bomber, the hierarchy of trust deepened. Pilots relied on gunners to call attacks early. Navigators and bombardiers relied on pilots to hold steady under fire. Engineers monitored systems that had already been hit once and might not survive another impact. Everyone carried more responsibility because fewer mistakes were survivable. Rest was insufficient. Between missions, crews slept in fragments, ate poorly, and rehearsed again. Briefings repeated the same warnings with new target names. The sky changed, but the pattern did not. Anticipation became a constant stressor, waiting for the next mission, the next test of whether the lessons learned would be enough. The enemy sensed these limits. German pilots increased coordination, testing defenses with feints before committing heavier attacks. They searched for moments when fatigue showed, when gunners fired late, when formations loosened, when escorts peeled away. The contest tightened into a duel of endurance rather than innovation. For Michael Aruth and others like him, the calculation remained brutally simple. Survive this mission. Then the next. Then one more. Tours were counted down in chalk marks, crossed off with relief and dread. The closer the end came, the heavier each remaining flight felt. Survival created veterans. Veterans created knowledge. Knowledge reduced losses, but never eliminated them. The cost was borne by the same men who made adaptation possible. The air war improved because survivors paid for the lessons with their nerves, their sleep, and their certainty. By early autumn, something else became clear. The environment itself was changing. Escort coverage extended farther. German fuel shortages increased. Replacement pilots arrived with less experience. The balance was beginning to shift, but it did not erase danger for those still flying. Limits had been reached and managed, but not escaped. The final question was not whether the tactics worked. It was whether they would hold long enough for the war to turn decisively. One chapter remains. What happened when survival stopped being the goal and legacy took its place? The legacy of the man at the back of the plane. When the air war over Europe finally shifted in America's favor, it did not do so because one weapon suddenly became superior, or one tactic proved perfect. It changed because thousands of small adjustments accumulated over time, adjustments paid for by men who survived long enough to learn. The tail gunner's legacy is part of that accumulation. For much of 1943, the rear of a bomber was the most vulnerable place in the sky. It was where geometry favored the attacker, where hesitation proved fatal, and where doctrine lagged behind reality. The men stationed there faced a problem that could not be solved by armor or firepower alone. It required a change in thinking. What gunners like Michael Aruth demonstrated was simple but profound. Initiative mattered more than obedience to outdated rules. By engaging earlier, by refusing to grant the enemy a perfect approach, tail gunners transformed a passive position into an active barrier. They did not make the bomber invincible. They made it unpredictable. That unpredictability altered the air battle. German pilots lost the certainty they relied on. Rear attacks became riskier. Firing windows shrank. Ammunition was expended without decisive effect. Over time, the Luftwaffe adapted. But with fewer resources, less fuel, and declining pilot experience, adaptation came slower than it had in earlier years. Meanwhile, American bomber crews grew more confident and more cohesive. Survivors taught replacements. Informal lessons spread faster than official manuals. Tactics refined under fire became standard practice, even before doctrine caught up. The air war became a contest of learning curves, and America's curve rose faster. The tail gunner's role remained brutal to the end. Cold still froze hands. Ammunition still ran low. Fighters still broke through. Many gunners did not survive long enough to see the balance shift. Their contribution is not erased by that fact. It is defined by it. The legacy is not one of heroics frozen in time. It is a legacy of adaptation under pressure. The man in the tail did not see the target. He did not drop the bombs. He did not navigate home. But when he succeeded, everyone else lived long enough to do their job. After the war, the position disappeared. Aircraft designs changed, tactics evolved. The plexiglass bubble at the rear of a bomber became a relic. Yet the lesson remained, carried forward into every form of modern combat aviation. When doctrine fails, experience must lead. When the enemy adapts, hesitation kills. When survival depends on seconds, action matters more than permission. That is the true legacy of the man at the back of the plane. Not the number of kills, not the citations or the statistics, but the fact that the bomber came home. And because it did, the war moved one mission closer to its end.